Hi, I'm Nicholas Floyd, the author of 7 Nights with Ayahuasca, and in this video I'll be taking a very down-to-earth and non-spiritual approach to discussing 3 of the more mystical aspects of ayahuasca, namely the discovery of ayahuasca itself, the concept of ayahuasca as an intelligence, and the concept of Mother Ayahuasca. Of course, in this video I'm not trying to change anybody's mind or prove anybody wrong, but rather my only goal here is to offer a few alternative perspectives to these 3 topics. And I'm no expert by any means in any of this stuff. I very well could be talking out of my ass here, so take this for what it's worth. Given that the Amazon rainforest contains tens of thousands of plant species, initially it might seem impossible that the shamans would ever select exactly the right vine and exactly the right leaf and boil the 2 together to come up with this amazing concoction known as ayahuasca. If you do the combinatorial mathematics on that, the number of possibilities is in the high hundreds of millions, quickly approaching a billion. And if you ask the shamans themselves how they ever figured out which 2 plants to use, they will often say that the plants told them, which only adds a layer of mystery to the whole thing. And while I do think that the discovery of ayahuasca is pretty amazing, I don't see it as this unfathomable miracle which requires some sort of supernatural explanation. Now, if people like myself, who have absolutely no botanical knowledge whatsoever, went down to the Amazon and spent generations and generations just randomly trying different combinations of plants, then sure, ayahuasca would probably never be discovered. But the thing to keep in mind here is that the Amazonian shamans, I think we can reasonably assume, were not going by blind trial and error, because they have this huge accumulation of botanical knowledge that could help guide them into their decisions of trying to find things that might be worthwhile. As a modern-day example, let's take into consideration something that's even less likely than the discovery of ayahuasca, and yet something which happens on a regular basis, namely the discovery of a security hole in a computer system. Now, even a very basic computer system is going to have almost an infinite number of possibilities as far as commands and input strings and mouse clicks and the timings of those inputs and so forth. And just like a person like myself who has no botanical knowledge probably would never discover ayahuasca, so too your average computer user, Joe Schmo, is probably never going to discover a security hole. Even if you have a glaring security hole, most people probably wouldn't even recognize it, much less know how to exploit it. But a highly trained hacker, analogous here to the Amazonian shaman, knows exactly what to look for because he has this giant repertoire of knowledge that allows him to test theories and kind of guide his decisions on what he's going to try. And so when I think of it that way, in terms of generations and generations of these highly skilled shamans kind of hacking their way through the jungle, the discovery of ayahuasca doesn't really strike me as any sort of miracle. And don't get me wrong, I do think it's pretty amazing and I have a lot of respect for the Amazonian shamans, so props to you, Amazonian shamans who are probably not watching this video. Oftentimes, people who try ayahuasca report making contact with an intelligence of some kind, or that the brew itself seems to have this sort of intelligence about it as the intoxication takes hold. And this was the case for me as well in my personal experience. As I described in the previous video and in my book, it is an overwhelming and utterly convincing and perhaps terrifying experience, and I can certainly understand why someone might think that it's real, because at the time it definitely feels that way. And that could be the case, I don't know, maybe it is real, but here's an idea that makes a little bit more sense to me. On a large dose of psilocybin mushrooms, oftentimes I will lose my sense of self to the point where if I look in the mirror, my own reflection is like a stranger staring back at me, because I no longer identify as that person or really as any person at all. And if the dose of mushrooms is strong enough, then I will not even recognize myself as a human being, but as this strange and novel ape-like creature staring back at me. And in that state of mind, it's utterly fascinating to see my own reflection. Even though I've seen it countless times before, it's all new, and the skeletal structure of this strange creature is fascinating, the way it allows it to stand upright, and its muscular structure that allows it to move about, and the sensory organs that allow it to perceive its external environment, and all this stuff is super fascinating, even though I've seen it all a million times before. And so with ayahuasca, what if something similar is happening? And this intelligence that I encounter is actually my own consciousness perceiving itself. So in other words, with ayahuasca, because I've so completely lost my sense of self, I'm not even able to recognize my consciousness as my own. And so instead I perceive it as this utterly foreign and outside intelligence. This would make sense to me for two reasons. So one is because one of the effects of ayahuasca is the complete loss of self, as I described in terms of my own thoughts sounding foreign to me and external drifting away from myself and those sorts of sensations. And also because when I had discussions with this intelligence, it wasn't like I asked a question and then there was a pause and then the answer came to me as you would have in a normal type of discussion, but rather just like that, in the snap of an instant, the question and the answer hit me at the same time. So it seemed to suggest that they were both coming from the same place. Ayahuasca is often described in quite literal terms as a female entity with human characteristics such as jealousy, and this tendency to project human qualities onto a plant or onto a psychedelic experience that strikes me as rather anthropocentric, and that brings about its own set of problems. But I'm willing to set that aside because to me the more glaring question is one of consistency. Namely, that the ayahuasca spirit is said to be this strong feminine entity, and yet ayahuasca shamanism is rife with sexism and misogyny. To illustrate this point, I'm going to read a brief passage from a book called Singing to the Plants by Stephen Beyer, in which he interviews an Amazonian shaman who says that, "For the ayahuasca vine to grow properly, it must not be seen by a woman, especially a woman who is menstruating or has not slept well because she was drunk. Quote, if those women see the ayahuasca, the plant becomes resentful and neither grows nor twines upright. It folds over and is damaged." End quote. For the same reason, Don Enrique Lopez says that anyone undertaking La Dieta must avoid women who are menstruating or who have made love the previous night. Menstruating women must even avoid touching or crossing over fishing equipment or canoes, lest they bring bad luck. And I'm going to read another passage from a different book. This one says, "Whenever a woman has her menstrual period, she will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. Anyone who touches her during that time will be unclean until the evening. Anything on which the woman lies or sits during the time of her period will be unclean. If any of you touch her bed, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. If you touch any object she has sat on, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean," yada yada yada. It goes on like that for several more sentences, condemning the filthiness of a menstruating woman and whatnot, and then talks about some other stuff and then circles back around to say, quote, "If a man has sexual relations with a woman during her menstrual period, both of them must be cut off from the community, for together they have exposed the source of her blood flow." So those latter quotes come from a book called the Bible, specifically from Leviticus chapter 15 verses 19 through 22 and chapter 20 verse 18. Now in both of those instances, with Christianity and with ayahuasca shamanism, it's really hard for me to see those restrictions as anything other than sexual repression by misogynistic men who are imposing their fears upon other people, as has unfortunately been the case time and time again in many different cultures throughout history. In the case of ayahuasca specifically, if the spirit of the vine were this strong feminine entity, it strikes me as very strange that she would be repulsed by a core component of womanhood, such as menstruation, and yet she seems to have no problem bestowing her graces upon the male shamans who propagate this sort of sexism and misogyny. So what makes a lot more sense to me is the idea that perhaps this strong feminine figure, this motherly figure that so many people report encountering, is perhaps actually the resurfacing of emotions from infancy, such as the emotions of nursing or being fed or being coddled, perhaps even being scolded. And all of these emotions would have been imprinted subconsciously at a very early time when either your mother or perhaps some other womanly figure was not only your primary caretaker, but also your lifeline. And so if you combine these emotions with the intelligence that I discussed earlier, then I could definitely see how those two could manifest into this strong feminine figure or motherly figure that people report encountering. And it makes sense to me because one of the primary effects of ayahuasca is precisely this sort of resurfacing of long forgotten or long suppressed emotions and memories. That's it for this video, and as I mentioned in the start, I don't pretend to be an authority on any of this stuff, so if it sounds like I'm just spewing a bunch of half-baked idiocy here, maybe that's an indication that I am. So leave me a comment and let me know what you think.